Before we begin diving deep into JavaScript that runs on our local machines, it's probably a good idea that we understand the execution environment in which JavaScript runs on our local machines, as well as on the servers to which we would deploy our software applications that we build in the JavaScript programming language. To do that, we're going to start off with looking at the execution environment, which we call Node. So it's Node.js is what it's called. So if you do a search for Node.js, the first one that should pop up is nodejs.org. And Node.js, what it is a utility. It is a piece of software that gets installed on your computer or on the server that you're going to be running your application on. And it is the software on top of which our JavaScript will run. So it's from this website that we would download and install the current version. Either it can be the long time support version, which is one that you would use for servers and deployments, and it's the stable version, the one that they know has very few defects or bugs, one that they have tested a lot. Whereas the current one has the latest and greatest features, might have a few bugs in it or some issues with new features that were implemented. And they provide this so that people can use it, get the latest features, and kind of test it as they use it and provide information back to the community as to bugs that they might find in the current release. Whereas this is the most stable release, this long-time support, or long-term support is what it's called. It says it right there. Alright, so this is Node, this is where you would get it, and we'll have a video on how to install it for Windows and how to install it for Mac in a minute. Today, we're going to focus solely on what Node is and how it works so that we have a better understanding of Node itself before we dive into actually running JavaScript in the Node environment. Now, on this website, you can learn and read a lot about Node just by coming to the About page, and you can get into the details of Node. We're going to stay pretty high in this video, at a pretty high level, in order to get kind of an overview of how Node works on our system and how it works with JavaScript. Because Node, although it has this .js on the end of its name, is not really a piece of JavaScript software. It's not a JavaScript library. It's something much more complex, but it does run JavaScript. It executes JavaScript on our machines. So to better understand this, what we're going to do is we're going to pull up a whiteboard, and then with this whiteboard, I'm going to go ahead and we are going to kind of draw out how all of this works. And so it's really important that we understand how Node works and why it works the way it is. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put some boxes up here so that we can see how these systems work together that make up Node. So to begin with, we usually have, or Node will be running on an operating system. And with an operating system, usually the reason why we have an operating system like Windows or Mac OS X or Linux is because that operating system knows how to communicate directly to a piece of hardware or a group of pieces of hardware that make up the physical computer that we can actually see when we look at it. So here, let's go ahead and let's identify these layers that live inside of our technology stack that makes up our computer. So I just talked about two of them. We've got the hardware that makes up the computer, so let's go ahead and let's label these items as well so we know what is what. So here we're going to have the hardware that makes up the computer that we're using. So this is the hardware. Then on top of that hardware, we're going to have our operating system, or OS. So operating system. And the operating system sits right on top of the hardware because it knows how to talk to that hardware. So it's an important part of how this technology ecosystem works inside of our computer. So we've got hardware, we've got our operating system, and then what happens is that when we install Node.js, Node.js is a piece of software that will sit right here on top of the operating system. and it knows how to communicate with the operating system directly. So let's go ahead and label that. We've got Node. So Node knows how to run right here on top of the operating system and knows how to communicate back and forth with the operating system. So let's go ahead and let's put some communication arrows in here so that we know how this communication traffic works. So the operating system, it knows how to communicate directly with the hardware. Okay? So if we need to access a hard drive in order to write files, or if we need to access the network in order to get onto the internet or onto our local network, that's all coming through the hardware, and the operating system is what works through the hardware in order to get to the disks and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so now let's talk about Node. So Node, it knows how to communicate with the operating system. So it's communicating directly to the operating system, and it lets the operating system know when it needs access to hardware. So if we are in Node building JavaScript, or we have a JavaScript program written, and that JavaScript program requests from Node the ability to write to a file, Node is actually going to handle the communication to the operating system, and then the operating system is going to handle the communication to the hardware in order to write to that file. With that, really what Node is it is this mechanism that can talk to the operating system. In other words, it understands the language the operating system understands. And usually that is going to be good old-fashioned ones and zeros. So we're going to have binary, right? So 001, 001, 11, 000, 111, right? I just made that up. So don't try to convert that binary. I have no idea what it says. So it understands binary, and Node also understands binary. So Node is going to be sitting right here, and it's going to be talking to the operating system, and it's going to be doing all of this through the language that the operating system understands. And that is primarily because inside of Node is a little system that's written in C++ and compiled down to machine language, and it knows how to communicate directly with the operating system. Now, when we write JavaScript applications, we're really just using a programming language that has been defined off of the ECMA script standard. So that's really just a standard that's over here that a standards body or group of people have put together, and they have told us what a programming language that follows the ECMA standard should look like. So this is really just a standard. It's a definition of what a language should be. So ECMA script standard. It tells us what a programming language should look like if it follows the ECMA standard. Now JavaScript is an implementation of the ECMA standard as a standalone programming language. So it sits right here. It is simply a programming language, and that's all it is, just a programming language. And so when we use JavaScript, we're using a language, a programming language that was defined off of that ECMA script standard. And of course JavaScript runs in the browsers, but the cool thing now too is that with Node, we can now execute JavaScript on our operating system like we would any other full-blown programming language like C# or Java or Ruby or Python or PHP, because we now have this execution environment called Node that runs on top of our operating system and can now access all of the hardware. Whereas before, JavaScript could only execute in a browser over here, and it had no ability to access the operating system and no ability to access the hardware. So this is where Node completely changed the JavaScript world, because it became a full-blown programming language that could be executed on your computer or on a server. And this allows us to build much more complex programs like we can with Python and C# and Java. All right, so Node, now what happens is that we simply create a program or something that we want to have executed, and we do that in JavaScript, and it's just a JavaScript program. And really, all a JavaScript program is, it's usually just a folder, And inside of that folder, we just have a bunch of source files, or files that have our code in them. And that code, of course, or these files, these source files, are all written in the JavaScript programming language. And usually we have one file that kicks off the entire program that may use all these other files inside of it, and that is going to be the index.js file. That's commonly what we call the file that kicks off the execution of our JavaScript program. So let's go ahead and identify that file. Oops, we lost our text, so we're going to go index.js. There we go. Now we'll go ahead and point it out. So let's say that this right here is our index.js. This is the file that actually kicks off our program when it gets executed. When we have a Node application that we've written, and let's go ahead and let's identify this as our JavaScript app. So JS app, this is our code, right? So source code. This is what we want to run to get our application to do what we wanted it to do. And then we have an index.js file. And then when we execute this index.js file using Node, what happens is that Node begins to execute this file, and when this file pulls in any of these other files in order to run the code that's in those files, what will happen is that as this gets executed inside of Node, it'll begin to pull in these other files into it as it needs the code that's in them. This is kind of a simplified description of how Node works. Later on we'll get into a more complex description, but we're going to keep ourselves at about the 30,000 feet so that we've got a broad overview of how it works. So what's going to happen here is when we do or execute the command, so here's our index.js, what will happen is we will execute a command through our command line, and we will say right here, we'll do node and space index.js, and this is going to be a command that gets executed in your terminal or your command prompt on your machine. And when we do this, what's really happening is we are asking our operating system, because we're doing this in the terminal, so let's go ahead and put a box around it just so we know that this is the terminal. This is the terminal on our operating system. And when we execute this command of node.js, node and then space index.js, I'm going to put a little pound right here just so we know that this is a command on the command prompt. And then we're going to go ahead and label this as our terminal or our command prompt in Windows. So terminal in Mac or on Linux, and then command prompt on Windows. I'm going to put it right down here. And of course, the terminal lives right here inside of our operating system. So the terminal lives in our operating system, and Node is an application that is running on top of our operating system. So when someone types the command node space index.js in the context of this source code folder, our application folder with all of these files in it, then what happens is our computer, it then takes the file that we specified, which was index.js, so it goes ahead and it's going to grab that file right here, and then it's going to move that file down into Node's execution environment. And then Node is going to begin executing all of the code inside of this file inside of its execution environment. And as it's executing this code, as it runs into lines of code that might need to access a hard drive or might need to access a network card and go off onto the internet, it is going to execute that code in here, and then it'll make requests to the operating system, and then the operating system will handle dealing with the hardware, and then either going across the internet if we wanted to do that, or write to a particular hard drive, to a file on a hard drive, or if we wanted to show something on the screen or render something. That's all going to happen through this communication from Node to the operating system and the operating system to the hardware. So in effect, what Node really is, if we really wanted to go with a simple to remember definition, Node itself is a JavaScript interpreter. In other words, it knows and understands how to read JavaScript, and then it can take that, it can then convert it to machine language, and then make those requests of the operating system, and then we go through that process right there. All right, so that is a pretty basic 30,000-foot view of how Node works on top of our operating system, how it can access hardware through the operating system, and how when we execute a Node application, we're really executing it within the terminal or command prompt that lives inside of the operating system. It knows how to communicate with the operating system. It calls the Node application that is living on top of our operating system and passes it a file that is written in JavaScript to begin executing. And since Node understands JavaScript and the operating system does not understand JavaScript, it is that interpreter that sits between the operating system and our code, and it translates our code written in JavaScript into machine language, which can then be executed by our operating system, which gives us access to all of the hardware on our computer, so that we can do amazing things just like we can with C#, Java, or Python. So really quick overview of Node right there for you. Next, we're going to move on to how do we install it on Windows and how do we install it on Mac OS.